We will begin with a few minutes of quiet, and a suggestion was made to me earlier that I may say a few words to invite us to be quieter. What we need in any quiet meditation is an attitude of prayer, because it is not a matter of myself asserting myself or demanding something, but wishing to receive something from a higher level. But physical attitudes of prayer actually interfere with breathing. You can try this. So, attitude of prayer, but posture of meditation. In which there is a verticality without rigidity, and enhancing our receptivity. The basic requirement for receptivity is relaxation. All tensions are self-assertions. So take a moment to be clear that your body is as relaxed as possible. For some people, closing their eyes is helpful, but for others it creates some anxiety. So you decide what is helpful for you. But more than physical relaxation, what is required is emotional relaxation. A little freedom from anxiety, worry, or wondering whether I'm approved or whether I'm even sitting rightly. And that is assisted a little bit if my emotional energy is used for something like gratitude. That I am grateful for the fact that I exist. And a sense of wonder. Why do I exist? A sense of wonder and anxiety cannot coexist. Also, intellectual relaxation. Even if I had the combined intelligence of Einstein, Aristotle, Nagarjuna, and Shankara, I cannot know all there is to know. So a little freedom from my knowledge, a slight willingness to be surprised. So take a few moments to be relaxed as much as one can. That enhances our receptivity. At the same time, it is not receptivity which is passive, so a certain amount of activity is required for me. Maintaining the right posture, and returning as frequently as I can, not merely mentally, but feeling-wise. Who am I? Why have I been created? Since we have gathered here really for essentially a seminar, so we cannot continue in our position of meditation now. So take maybe 3 more breaths. Then we'll have an exchange, or I speak something. Since at least a couple of people are here for the first time, we are basically really speaking about the 2 major spiritual traditions which have been labeled as Abrahamic traditions, including what goes under the name of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and Indian tradition, including Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism. Frequently, they get also labeled East and West, which is, of course, very much arising from the British notion of what is East and what is West, because some of you would know one of the most famous books in China, in translation, it is called Journey to the West, and it is Journey to India. So India is the West from their point of view. So don't get so attached to this East and West, but it is true that particularly in the Western world, since the 4th century, with Emperor Constantine becoming a Christian, until that time, it was dangerous to be a Christian in the West. After that, it was dangerous not to be a Christian. You can read any scholarly history on this, and you can, I'm really mostly quoting some scholar or the other saying. So East and West are just labels of one kind or the other. But what is actually rather important here, that in the Western world, which is dominantly Christian, secular powers and religious powers got intertwined very much. So at some time, the Pope could decide who the king will be, or then later on the king could decide who the Pope will be. All that became very much intertwined. And this has been almost the case since then, even though because of the rise of the scientific revolution and the whole sort of shift from more or less theocentric occupation to human-centric occupation from the 17th century onwards, still everywhere, wherever the Western powers ruled, they tried to bring Christianity to be also imposed on the regions there, everywhere. So religion and secular power have been very intimately connected in the Western world. And this is, since we are speaking about 2 major traditions, you see this is a great contrast For example, in India, even traditionally, if a monk came into the court of a king, the king will rise and will touch his feet. This is the classical description. So the secular power was always considered lower than the spiritual power. They were not intimately connected with each other. In any case, as I have said, that I will be speaking about what is common to these traditions and what is different. And I am still continuing with what is really common to these traditions. By the way, just as an example of secular power and religious power being combined together, for example, in the what we call the Anglican Church, but in USA, I think you call it the Episcopal Church, right? King or the queen is automatically the head of the church. This is now actually creating a lot of confusion in Canada, especially because Canada, being still the queen was, and now the king will be, the head of Canada. And any parliamentary member who is elected, or even in the legislature, they have to vow to the king. And in Quebec, where people are mostly Roman Catholics, they are saying that the king is going to be from their, this is their language, he's going to be the Pope of the Anglican Church. So why should we bow to this new Pope rather than to our own Pope? So this is creating a whole political conflict actually in Canada, whether they should therefore allow people not to take this kind of vow, which would require a constitutional change, which is never so easy anywhere. So I mentioned some of these things have continuity. But this congregation of spiritual or religious power and political power is very deeply seated since the 4th century in the Western world. But I'm still really trying to largely speak about what is common to all of these traditions so far. One is, according to all the sages everywhere, that in general human beings do not live the way they should. And furthermore, the way they could. Simply to say they don't live the way they should is easy to say. But what makes a sage is they precisely demonstrate how one could live. For example, it gets used in varieties of ways. In the Buddhist tradition, one would say, we live as if we are asleep, but we could wake up. That's literally what the word Buddha actually means. Buddha means one who is awake. And in the Christian context, one might say that one lives in sin, but one could live in grace. Or in Vedantic tradition, one might say one lives in illusion, but one could live in reality. Or in the Gurdjieffian tradition, they would say one lives mechanically, but one could live consciously. So there are varieties of ways of saying it, but it is always the underlying idea is that in general, human beings do not live the way they should. And then, of course, unless a teacher or a sage demonstrates how one could live more consciously, how one could live in reality, or how one could actually live as if one is awake to reality, then they are not going to be considered great sages for any length of time. Although sometimes people can pretend for some time and carry on. This happens everywhere. But sooner or later, they are disregarded from being great sages. So this is one of the things which is very common to all teachings. The notion that in general human beings do not live the way they should. So it is therefore a call to all of us, because when we say human being, this also applies to me. It applies to all of us. Okay, the other thing which is common to all teachings, I think in a way I have already been somewhat commenting on it, that there are two in us, in each one of us. It gets expressed in varieties of ways. One is that one part is coming from the spiritual side, the other is coming from the material or the animal side. St. Paul uses the expression spiritual nature and carnal nature. Sometimes it gets expressed as capital S self and small s self, which is possible in the Latin script, but not in the Devanagari script, because there we don't have the capital S and the small s. So it has to be understood in the context there. Or, for example, Jean de Salzmann, my own teacher, he referred to this angelic nature and animal nature. And sometimes it simply gets called as I and me. So we don't need to get attached to one particular expression, but the notion is that one is coming from the spiritual side and the other one from the material side. And I had already mentioned this, that according to all the teachings, the whole manifested universe is created by the highest level of consciousness, called God or Allah or Brahma, whatever label is attached to that. Just the characteristics of these are, usually they would say it can't be described, but then some hints are given. Love, truth, beauty, consciousness. So, but the manifested universe is by involution, contrary to the overall scientific perspective, where the manifested universe is by evolution, starting from the lowest level of consciousness, from dead matter, and gradually life coming. So it's completely contrary to the overall scientific perspective. But then this is the universe is obviously manifested at different levels, different creatures, and therefore the call is for each level to evolve in order to return to the source, return to God. And therefore, the suggestion that this spiritual element, I think I have already mentioned this more than once, but it is so common a mistake that it may be worth repeating it, that the word soul is different from spirit. Soul is personal. Your soul is different from my soul. But spirit is transpersonal. And the particle of divinity that has taken on my body is the soul in this body, which the call for this soul is to evolve so that it can come to the level of the spirit. There are, in the New Testament, I think I have already mentioned this, there are two distinct words for this, but since the 16th century, largely because of Descartes' writings, these have been mixed up. So people just imagine that I have an eternal soul or eternal spirit, something like this. Soul is actually, to quote my favorite Western philosopher, Plotinus, is my most favorite Western philosopher. He said, our soul is amphibious in nature. It can sink completely into matter, or it can soar into the one. So the trouble is that this soul, which takes on this body, I use the word body simply for ease of speaking, but it includes the mind, ordinary mind. So this soul takes on the body for its own evolution, but then it can get very much occupied with the desires and the fears of the body. And practically all the sages say in one way or the other that the entire world is being driven by fears and desires. I think I quoted this remark of Christ in the Bible: the whole world is in the sway of the prince of darkness. But we don't need to simply accept or buy these remarks. Look around. What is running your own life? That's easier to look at, but usually harder actually to seriously, impartially to look at oneself. It's easier to look at the others. What do you think is running the life of the people who are running the world now? Putin, Xi, Trump was just running, now Biden, Modi. What is ruling them? It's easier to look at all the large forces in the world, what is driving them? But it also applies to us. Unless one actually begins to see, this is the overall idea, first of all, that the entire manifested universe in principle is mirrored inside us. If that is true, and since all the sages say it, it's not a good idea to easily dismiss this. So, therefore the devil is also manifested in me. Why not? He is also part of the universe. So is God. And the suggestion is that we have element of divinity in us, but also the element of the devil in us. If you prefer more modern kind of terminology, this is the shadow side or the obstacle side. I think I mentioned the other day that the word Satan in Old Hebrew and the word Mara in Old Sanskrit or Pali literally means obstacle. So what stands in our way? And is there anything, anybody could say that nothing stands in our way? So those obstacles are part of our own psychic sort of being occupied by these devilish natures. Actually, Rumi has this very interesting remark. If you have not yet seen the devil, go look in the mirror. Devil, just like God, can be personified in a very large way, as if he has to be having big horns, etc. But if one looks at it as only selfish tendencies, that's the devilish side. Which of us doesn't have that? And the divine side will be, I will actually now quickly speak about what are the, as I said, there are two natures. They have certain kind of characteristics attached to them. And here let me read some of them, what they are. The self with a capital S or I or the divine nature, whatever label appeals to you, has to do with meaning, purpose. Why have I been created? If and when one seriously raises this question, that is already arising from a different level in one. When did you last time raise this question? Ask yourself seriously. You see, this is why I keep saying all of this talk is very nice philosophical mumbo jumbo, unless I see that all scriptures or any teaching actually, how does it apply to me? How do I respond to this? Otherwise, it's very nice to say what Krishna said or what Christ said. None of this would have any meaning. So, when did I last wonder about why do I exist? What is the purpose of my existence? But this is the area, or these are the kinds of issues that are of concern to the spiritual side in us. And also they are associated with sense of compassion, sense of oneness with the others. The others are just like me. Also created by the divine force, also here only for a few decades. And they have the same kind of difficulties and the problems as I do, same kind of limitations. And the other side, which we could say small s self or me, whatever label appeals to you, has to do with survival, continuity, fear, desire, gain, loss, reward, punishment, approval, disapproval. And again a reminder that even though sometimes these words seem as if, well, it's not so obvious to me that there are two in me, I will tell you a little incident. This is actually 1977, George Wald had just won a Nobel Prize in biophysics. And his main, really the research that he did was how the eyes operate. And I was asking him some question, and he said, you know, we can say exactly if you move the retina this way or that way or the lens, what will change. But there is no way we can say, we can put the whole structure of the eye together, but it doesn't see. Something else is seeing through the structure of the eye. That is why he, as a Nobel Prize winner in science, was now shifting his interest more and more. Then he was of Jewish origin. Until that time, he was just dismissing all the Jewish teaching, etc. Then he says, now I'm going to take it seriously, what they are saying, the spiritual side. That there is obviously something in us which is seeing through the structure of the eye. We can create the structure, but it doesn't see. And increasingly, in fact, that was one of the sources of this. Even in the philosophic world, in the last 20-odd years, more and more interest in consciousness probably having started the universe rather than the matter having started the universe. We now even have a whole different project called the Galileo Commission, where this is really more or less the fundamental idea, to try to kind of revise the basic assumptions of modern science. Not an easy project, because modern science is so intimately connected with modern technology and therefore power. As I mentioned the other day, more Nobel Prize winners in any country, more hydrogen bombs in that country. So it goes, this is how the Western powers have actually conquered the rest of the whole world, through bigger weapons. One needs to actually look at historically impartially. Then one would see that power largely coming from technology, and technology got associated with science mostly at the end of the 19th century in Germany, starting. Before that, it was separate, actually, the two, technology and science. For example, the development of the steam engines, etc., was quite independent, or even the telephone was started quite separately from scientific background. But after the end of the 19th century, it got intimately connected with each other. And during the development of the atomic bomb, more Nobel Prizes were won in physics during those 5 years or 4 years than ever before. It's very intimately connected. So, in fact, we have tried to, it's difficult to get a proper survey on this, but you can check if you have a way of doing that. More than 90% people who have PhDs in physics work either for the industry or for the military. Are they searching for truth? One needs to really look at all this impartially. What power, technology is so intimately connected, and when we say power, it's really more and more accumulation of power or wealth. This is the driving principle, which is why this remark, whether of Christ or take the Buddha saying that the whole world is driven by fear and desire. That's another way of saying this. So, in any case here, the suggestion is that we have two in us. But this is the reason I mentioned what some of their characteristics are. I would be completely surprised if anybody here does not at least occasionally feel wondering, why am I here? And as I said, it arises actually from two different directions. One is just a sense of wonder, which is the one way one is actually free of anxiety and fear, as I mentioned earlier. Wonder and anxiety cannot coexist. Try it. But sometimes the same question arises from fear. Oh my goodness, I've done well in life, but now I'm going to die. What's the point of that? And here I want to draw your attention to something. This is actually a report from New York Times in 1980, when the two major companies were not Google, etc., but they were General Electric and General Motor. And the reason I am actually bringing this example, let me first of all give a little background to this. I was very surprised when I came to Canada hearing the word midlife crisis. You never hear this in India or in China. And when I gave some thought to this, to me it seemed very clear that what is actually happening, because in a way, for example, Patanjali in the Yoga Sutra even explicitly says that the whole Prakriti is in the service of Purusha. And if I have two in me, in general, the call is that my lower nature or carnal nature is meant to be in the service of my spiritual nature, because it is the spiritual side which has taken on my body. It's not that my body has taken on the soul, it's the other way around. And then there is, in the usual life of most human beings, usually around the age of 16 or so, it's a little different for males and females, there is the possibility of creating a fleshly birth. But the call is for a spiritual birth, and that usually takes place between the ages of 40 to 50. Wish for a spiritual birth. I have been actually trying to persuade some of these psychologists to try to study this, that what we call midlife crisis is actually a call internally for a spiritual birth. Now I come back to this report in New York Times in 1980, because it is also true that these two large companies that I just mentioned, General Electric, General Motor, at that time these were the biggest companies. Some of their big officers have obviously done very well. They're earning a lot of money, and they're having a midlife crisis. Now, what does this usually mean these days? They move away from their own wives. Usually they are males who are reported, and find some young girls to entertain them, or buy cars without hoods on them, etc. You know, the kind of thing, midlife crisis. So, but then they don't want to continue doing the kind of jobs they were doing, some of them. So these companies, this is a New York Times report. In the Bahamas, they had found a resort where they had invited some nice-looking young ladies to remove their midlife crisis for a couple of weeks, so they can come back and continue their jobs. Now, therefore, strong social urge to interfere with the spiritual birth. Because, just to maybe remind you, always the suggestion is that one needs to be born again, twice. Let me actually give you a background of this, especially my minister of the church here would recognize. 3rd chapter in John's Gospel. Nicodemus, who is the member of the Jewish Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin means the council, basically. By the way, this is the council which by majority ultimately decided to crucify Christ, but only by a majority vote. Not everybody there voted for this. In fact, 2 of the members of the Sanhedrin, Nicodemus being one, and another one, these were the 2 taking care of the body of Christ after his death. His disciples had run away. They were not even around. So one should not imagine that everybody in the council was against him. In any case, Nicodemus is struck by whatever he has seen about Christ or heard about him. So he wanted to come and ask for his wisdom or advice. But it's a little bit like a cardinal from the Roman Catholic Church going to the Dalai Lama for counsel. So he has to sneak out at night. So he comes in the middle of the night. You can read all this in the gospel. I'm just giving you the reference, 3rd chapter in John's gospel. So his very first question is, how can one enter the kingdom of heaven? And what is the response of Christ? One has to be born again, born of the Spirit. Throughout human history, in every teaching, the suggestion is that we are obviously born of the flesh, but that we need also to be born of the Spirit. In India, this expression is called Dvij, twice born. But now it has become simply a caste label. Dvij literally means twice born. But now it is just a caste label. But this is how all cultures degrade, in any case, everywhere. I'll give you some other examples of this later. I mean, India has no monopoly of degradation than any other culture does. They all have it. So, therefore, my own impression very strongly is that just the very fact that I am a part of natural birth, that both of these births are intimately possible, connected with my life. But fleshly birth is easier to see. And then also the very strong suggestion, this is another remark of Christ in the same chapter, only that can go to heaven which came down from heaven. Only the spiritual side goes to heaven, not the bodily side. I'll come back to this because this becomes very intimately connected with people's notion as if one can bodily go to heaven. Like Mother Mary said to her, go to heaven bodily. So is Prophet Muhammad, so is Jesus. And therefore, strong notion that cremation is not a good idea. One needs to preserve the body, and then after the next judgment, the body will arise again. So the spirit and the body are very intimately connected in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And in fact, this is a very deep notion of cremation, sorry, not cremation, but burial. That the body should be preserved as far as possible because it's going to rise again. So, in any case, you need to think about what do you think is the midlife crisis. In general, the ages for that are between the ages of 40 and 50. But sometimes, of course, there are people, Shankara, for example, became a monk at the age of 12. So, I mean, there are exceptions, or Mozart was playing music very early on. How many people could be doing this? So there are exceptions to every of this general kind of rules and regulation that I'm speaking about. But always the suggestion is that the attachment to the lower self or the needs of desires and fears is very deeply seated in our whole body and mind. In fact, Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita uses, when he speaks about that I have taken on the senses, he also says that I have taken on manas. Manas is the reference to the usual lower mind. In Sanskrit, there are two distinct words, manas and buddhi. Buddhi is really referring to, if you like, higher mind or clear mind. Like in English, we end up having just one word, mind, which creates a lot of difficulty itself. Monkey mind or Buddha mind, both gets called mind. But even in the Greek language, there was a word nous, N-O-U-S, which referred to higher mind, and dianoia, which referred to the lower mind. And the suggestion in the Bhagavad Gita very strongly is by Krishna that when he says, I take on the senses, he includes the manas among the senses. That the ordinary mind is just more or less a prostitute of the bodily needs and desires. It will justify anything. and would just carry on the same thing. Whatever the body needs or fears, that the ordinary mind will do that. Which is why the main yoga that Krishna teaches in the Bhagavad Gita is Buddhi Yoga. Much to my surprise, most yoga teachers don't even know that there is Buddhi Yoga. 3 times in the Bhagavad Gita, in the beginning of his teaching, which is in the 2nd chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, and the end of his teaching, which is the 18th chapter in the Bhagavad Gita, and in the middle of his teaching, which is the 10th chapter in the Bhagavad Gita, 3 times he says that the main yoga that I'm teaching is Buddhi Yoga. But hardly I ever hear any of the yoga teachers even mention this yoga. I had written a paper on this in 1978. Cambridge University Press had published it. So it created some academic kind of interest. But yoga teachers don't study any of these academic things anyway. So they are not even aware of this. But that's the main yoga that Krishna teaches, Buddhi Yoga, which means essentially yoga of awareness. Because Buddhi, this is actually a remark of a great sage in India, Sri Anirban, that it has both a psychological aspect and a cosmological aspect. An example of this is, in fact, only yesterday I had driven and gone on to a very nice viewpoint in Ojai here, from where I could look at some mountains with snow. Ojai is very beautiful, by the way. People who live here may not realize this, or may not feel it. But coming from elsewhere, one is very struck by this. It's extraordinarily beautiful. In any case, the reason I'm mentioning this example, but I'm still on this side, but I can see the other side. Only from a certain perspective or from a certain place. So Buddhi is said to be like that it is, my Buddhi is separate from your Buddhi, but it can see something which is transpersonal, cosmological. So it has both of these aspects to it, personal and transpersonal. Which is what, of course, the reason why Krishna is teaching Buddhi Yoga, because from then, therefore, one can be more and more aware of what he simply calls aware of the embodied. He doesn't even call it soul or spirit. The word in Sanskrit is dehi, the embodied. So one can be in the body and become aware of that which has taken on the body. Yeah. So when one actually begins to see this in oneself, or you look at any of the, I don't know whether you people on your computer get spam mails every day. I get many of them. What are they doing? What are they proposing? Look at any advertisement. What are they advertising? So to imagine that we are just theoretically saying that the world is being driven by fear and desire, no, just look at the way the world is driven. Then it'll be easier to see. Then, of course, another thing which is common to all teachings, one would think it's really rather obvious, but it's really an across-death causality. First of all, something that I mentioned yesterday, just simply to repeat this in a few words, that the death of the body is not the death of the person. It's common to all teachings. Therefore, the implication is that the person is not exclusively the body. In fact, he is more the soul or the spirit. That's the implication. But I'm always surprised in the English language, in all Indian languages, at least that I am aware of, when a person dies, we say sharir tyag, meaning he has left the body. But for some reason in English we say he has given up the ghost. Now, what does it mean? That he's basically the body, but he has given up the ghost? Which is completely strange to me. But it's good to sort of see how the culture shifts a little bit, how the language itself is, or is it said some other way? That's at least what I hear. When somebody's died, they say he's given up the ghost. We have some people here from India, they can verify or question what I'm saying, that in all Indian languages, as far as I know, it's sharir tyag. having given up the body. But then there is this across-death causality, that whatever we do in this life is going to have consequences in the post-mortem life. In the Indian tradition, this gets very deeply associated with the law of karma, is the usual way of saying this. But that is also really, may not be the same expression, is not used. But here is a remark of St. Paul. I should remind people again and again that St. Paul, his letters constitute more than a third of the entire New Testament. So it's not easy to dismiss, the whole of the New Testament, more than a third are his letters. And he was the only apostle of Christ who did not see him physically, just encountered him spiritually. In fact, before that, he was actually persecuting the Christians. And after his vision, he completely transformed and became the main, if you like, really almost the main teacher of the future generation of Christians. And that is often indicated, actually in the Bible more frequently, but even elsewhere. Name is given importance. So if a person is undertaken a transformation, their name is changed. Abraham became Abraham. Saul became Paul. There are other changes of the prophets also. The name change. So St. Paul makes this remark, this is the letter to the Galatians. Don't be under any illusion. You cannot make a fool of God. A man's harvest in life will depend entirely on what he sows. If he sows for his own lower nature, his harvest will be the decay and death of his own nature. But if he sows for the Spirit, he will reap the harvest of everlasting life by the Spirit. Here I should make one other little distinction. Actually, if you look at the translations of the Gospels, particularly after approximately 1955 or so, in many places the word everlasting got changed to eternal. And the reason is that these two are completely different words. Eternal has nothing to do with time, but it is not against time. Everlasting has to do just continuity in time. And according to all the sages, what is required is a little freedom from what continues in time. The way Krishnamurti would more emphasize it, the freedom from what we know, which is just what we know from the past, etc. Everlasting simply means continuity in time. Eternity is, if you like, we would say in physics, is orthogonal, at right angles to the dimension of time, but it is not against time. It can manifest in time at any time, but it is not continuing in time. Let me give two simple examples. One is, there are many stories in India like this. Somebody is given a great vow by some large god or higher god, and this spirit comes to him, says, okay, you ask whatever you want, I'll give it to you. But if you don't want anything, or if you stop asking, then I'll kill you. So, of course, the person first of all asks for a big palace. He wants lots of gold, like everybody else. So he gets all this. And then he doesn't know what else to ask for. So now he's afraid he'll be killed. So he has this clever idea. He says, bring a pole. You go up the pole, When you go to the top, then you come down the pole. When you're at the bottom, then you go up the pole. So you can keep doing it everlastingly. See, everlasting can be just that. Continuity in time, but remaining at the same level. Another example, which don't take it too literal-mindedly, difference between love and marriage. Marriage has history. Love does not have history. It can be prior to marriage, it can be after marriage, it can be within marriage or outside marriage, but it is not against marriage. So, eternity is not against time. It can manifest any time in time. Eternal wisdom is not everlasting, but it can manifest at any time and time. So one needs to be a little clear about these two words. And since there has been much scholarly debate about this, I actually have a whole article on this, if you are interested. On my website, there are many articles. One of them is really this: everlasting is not eternal. But about one of the things that gets always used by organized religions, as well as really all of us generally, fear and desire. Here is a remark of William Butler Yeats. Actually, he has a poem on death. Nor dread nor hope attend a dying animal. A man awaits his end, dreading and hoping all. This is what religions use. You're going to go to hell unless you do this and this and that, and you can go to heaven if you do this and this and that. Dread and hope. Buying and selling, this is exactly what takes place. But really the general call from a spiritual point of view is not a question of having myself continue the way I am everlastingly. By the way, I should also mention this. Those of you who are especially interested in the Bible, the word everlasting or eternal you cannot find in any of the Gospels. But it entered the Christian theology very soon afterwards. This itself, you can check all this. This is easy to find. Because the teaching of Christ is not the same kind of thing as the priests and the ministers are talking about. Their concerns really are how the church can flourish, how can more alms be given. It's the same thing about reward and punishment. And so they appeal to reward and punishment. You'll go to heaven if you do X, Y, Z, or you'll go to hell if you don't do this and that. And this part I have already spoken, so I won't go into this, but that the whole idea of what we call human incarnation, it is obvious that I did not create myself. But then if one stays with this for a few moments and really thinks about it, even to say that I am breathing is completely erroneous. I did not create this breathing apparatus, or the air that I need to breathe to stay alive. I am being breathed, and explicitly, this is the book of Genesis, if you like, 2nd chapter, 7th verse, this is what it says. God created human beings from the earth, then he breathed his own breath into them to make them alive. As long as this character Ravi is alive, it's the breath of God that is keeping him. The moment that breath leaves, the Ravi expires. Which is why so much emphasis on paying attention to one's breathing, because breath and spirit have the same word in most ancient languages, or very close to each other. And in fact, one of the Upanishads says, Pranavai Brahma. Pran is Sanskrit word for what we get, breath. English word breath doesn't convey that richness as the word chi still does in Chinese and prana in Sanskrit. But this Upanishad says prana is Brahma. This is the highest level of reality. Therefore, very strong emphasis in many meditational practices, particularly paying attention to one's breath, and then one would see, this is another remark that perhaps I've said that earlier also, awareness is the mechanism of transformation. You can easily verify this. Just pay attention to your breath for a few moments. You will see the quality of your breath will change. Don't try to force a change. Don't try intentionally to deepen it or anything like this. And certainly not to hold your breath outside or inside, but just simply become aware of the fact that breathing is taking place. Guaranteedly, the quality of your breathing will change. In general, in the medical books, you would see that an adult human being breathes 13 to 20 times a minute. I'm always completely surprised by this because I try to watch myself. Rarely do I breathe more than 7 to 10 times a minute. But you watch your own breath. Anybody who has practiced any yoga for any length of time, guaranteed they do not breathe more than 13 or 14 times. But just don't take my word for it. Just I keep saying what I wish for are a group of fellow searchers, not believers in this or that, because this believing business is just a waste of time. Searching, questioning, verifying, accepting if it is true for you. But in any case, strong emphasis on looking at one's breathing and not intentionally trying to change it, but to see awareness is the mechanism of transformation. This is the fundamental reason why all the teachings, in one way or the other, emphasize impartial self-study. You could call it self-inquiry or self-observation, self-knowledge. Different words get used, partly because it's difficult to translate one single word from Sanskrit. Swadhyay is the Sanskrit word, and it is very much emphasized in Patanjali. This is one of the three major practices he speaks about in the first sutra of the second chapter. And it is also included in what are called yam and niyam, observations and hindrances. And in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna repeatedly speaks about it, and then particularly at one stage says that people practice spiritual practices in many different ways, but for those of serious vows, what is recommended is swadhyaya. But one can also see how the cultures inevitably degenerate. If you look at contemporary Sanskrit English dictionary, the first meaning they give of swadhyaya, there is no complexity about it. Just two words in Sanskrit, swa plus adhyaya, literally meaning self-study. There is no complexity. But the first meaning they give now in Sanskrit dictionaries, reading sacred books. Only third or fourth meaning is self-study. I remember a conversation I was once having with Krishnamurti, and I was just mentioning this to him. At least in my understanding, he never used that kind of language in public, but he says, "Damn it, sir, what is the point of studying sacred books unless you study the book of yourself?" I'm, as you know, a great fan of Krishnamurti. I often end up quoting him in one thing or the other. No, because this is really the serious call by all the sages. but it gradually, every culture has this tendency to make it kind of mass level, especially the religions go at a very mass level. And the call everywhere is to be, in fact, the very word education, if you look at the root of that word, means to let what is deep inside you is to emerge. That's the root of the word education. What are we doing in education? Imposing information. I invite you to look at the etymological meaning of some of these words. You will be surprised. To allow something to emerge from inside. That's the root meaning of the word education. Let's take a moment silence, and then we have to stop. I hardly started today, but that's the way it is. That arise or any insights you wish to add to something I said or try to clarify something, please do so. Also on Zoom, anybody wishes to speak?
Recording in progress.
Yes.
You had, and you mentioned that there's two of us inside, or two things going on simultaneously within us, and that there's like the small self and the big self, and that that the purpose of the soul, that the soul is lame without the body, but without having the small self guiding the body, where there's survival, then the body would die. So there needs to be some element of survival, selfish needs, desires fulfilled in order for the body to survive, for the soul to not be lame and be able to go on its journey. The area where I've been having difficulty is trying to find the balance between where those two can coexist at their appropriate levels. If that makes sense. So just kind of opening it up for the group, like for example, for one thing to survive, it needs to eat nourishment of some kind, if it's a plant, light, it's an animal, food. But at the same time, that will take away light or food from a different being. And so there has to be some sort of level of,
No, actually the question you are raising or the remarks you are making are absolutely at the heart of the whole issue to do with spiritual search. Because there is a bit of a tendency to imagine that, I should not care for the body or the mind or living in the world. This is not the suggestion. For example, if you read carefully, say the Bhagavad Gita or the Yoga Sutras or anything in the Gospels, nobody is suggesting to get rid of the body or to get rid of the world. In fact, I have already quoted once already, let me repeat this for some people that are new here, the remark of Ishwar Krishna, who is the author of the Sankhya Karika, a whole large school of philosophy in India called Sankhya, that spirit without the body is lame, body without the spirit is blind. For the spirit, or we could call it the soul if you like, or the spiritual element, for it to act in the world, it requires a body. And I use the word body, but it includes also the mind. So there is certainly no need to be against the body or the mind. In fact, this is something which I should probably take a few moments to elaborate. Even the word ego, especially from the beginning of the 20th century, this word has been used essentially for the most negative side. Ego simply literally means the self or I. Let me remind people here, especially of Christian background, all the major expressions of Christ, such as I am the way, the truth, and the life, they all begin with the word ego, coming from Greek. Ego, eimi, I am. That's how they all begin. So the word ego simply really means the self. And then one would realize that it has many levels. I can be completely self-occupied or self-centered, or occasionally, as I was saying, to my own surprise, I find something I do which is selfless. So the call, actually this is more emphasized even language-wise in the Indian tradition, that even the lowest self needs to be included. In fact, let me give a little bit more background to this. Since one of the expressions of the highest divinity in India is Sat Chit Anand, consciousness, truth, and delight or joy. One could use joy, happiness, delight, many words get used. And there, even the lowest level of pleasure is included. For example, a great Upanishad called Atriya Upanishad says, imagine a young man in a close embrace with his beloved. That is one unit of joy. And then, of course, it continues multiplying it. Ultimately, it says one who truly knows himself has the real joy. So but it's not against that lower level joy. Sexual pleasure is also pleasure. And if you see any of the ancient temples in India, particularly before the British, because for the British, no sex, please, I am British. It's a different attitude. But before that, you look at any of the ancient temples in India, the lower levels would often have all kinds of sexual postures on them. There is no need to be against this, but not to be stuck with that level. That there are different levels of joy, different levels of delight. In fact, I think I mentioned the other day, Aurobindo, one of our great sages in the 20th century, saying that the delight created the universe for delight. That is his remark. And so, therefore, there is no need to be against the lower self that is required to do anything in the world. In fact, I often say, the soul needs an instrument, and my body and mind is the instrument. Why be against the instrument? The instrument needs to be sharpened, needs to be clean, well kept, which is the reason, from my point of view, it's absolutely sensible. This is a remark of Jean de Salzman, which I have already quoted. Ego is a good servant, but a bad master. For it to take over everything is not a desirable idea, but who wants a servant who wants to just lie around doing nothing? And I also remind people often, only those who have a strong ego can actually undertake any serious practice. And to stay with it, not give up easily, determination, all that comes from the ego. But then, how do I learn also to submit to something subtler, higher, that calls? So there is certainly no need to be against the ego or against lower levels of anything, but not to be stuck with them, not to be wholly dominated by them. But only the people with strong ego can actually practice some freedom from the ego. I occasionally say only the rich can practice poverty. The poor have no choice. One needs to be very clear about these things, otherwise one is not practical, one is just theoretically quoting some damn thing or the other. If you actually see this in life, what is required, maybe if people are interested, I give you a specific example. This is in 2001, the Theosophical Society had an international conference in Sydney, Australia. And they invited two people, myself and Samdhong Rinpoche. Some of you would know his name. He was at that time the head of the Sarnath Institute of Tibetan Studies in India. Later on, he became the Prime Minister of the Tibetan government in exile for 8 years. Now, we're supposed to speak for 1 hour. It takes me 2 days to get there, 2 days to come back. But that's life. So afterwards, then we were asked to speak with each other, having like a public exchange. Samdhang Rinpoche and myself. And it is sort of so deeply rooted in the religious traditions about get rid of the ego, etc. So this is what he more or less ended up saying as a general expression. And it might have initially sounded rude to some people even, but I asked him, if I had not done a PhD and had not written some books, do you think they will invite me here? Mm-hmm. And I said, if you are not the head of the Sarnath Institute, do you think they will invite you here? And how do we become this? And as you can well imagine, sort of stunned silence. But after a little while, he and I became really very close friends. In fact, on one occasion, I was completely surprised. I was at the Theosophical Society in India. Somebody knocks at my door, and it's Samdhang Rinpoche. He says, I had just discovered that you were here. I wanted to come and see you. So we became very good friends afterwards. But because he is a man who could actually see the point I was making, not feel insulted by my disagreement, which is part of the trouble. In that sense, of course, he has a strong ego, but he could be also free of it and not be wholly occupied with this. So I strongly suggest to you not to get occupied with any of these expressions that so-called religious people use. They are so full of themselves, very low-level ego. It's not. So occasionally they get arrested and put into jail, etc. Luckily, just recently, as you know, one of the cardinals has been sentenced. It goes on. In India, there are so many of these gurus are in jail now, happily. So I say, all these expressions can sound nice, but are they actually carrying them out, or they are actually practicing something? So don't get attached to it. Actually, whatever is said, if it strikes you, take time to see, how do I respond to it? How does it relate to me? Yes, please.
I think I heard from you many years ago this a quote that really stayed with me, and I think it applies to the context. Ego is a poor master, but a good servant.
Yes. 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 Yes, that's actually, in fact, a remark of Jeanne de Salzmann, my teacher. She said, ego is a good servant, but a bad master. And it was in the context of a slightly larger version, which I vaguely mentioned the other day. I'll repeat this since you're here now for the first time. I was myself struck by my own large amount of vanity in me. But I also realized that it is just a waste of energy and time, that I gain nothing by this. So I asked her, how could I be free of this? And this is when I was so surprised by her response. She said, if you did not have vanity, what will you do? That everything in our life begins from there. Wanting to gain something, to achieve something, even to get to heaven, even to be the good servant of God or whatever. It all begins from one's own achievement or wishing for approval of some kind. But this is when she ended with that remark. She says, when the real self is there, then the ego finds its proper place. And this is where, then she said, ego is a good servant, but a bad master. That was the whole background. Yes?
As I'm learning and just absorbing everything you're sharing, and I'm very much in the learning stage, in understanding the soul is within our body and our mind, I often question, how is the mind derived and where do the thoughts originate?
How can mind derive what?
Where is our mind derived from? And where do the thoughts originate if our soul is within the body?
Well, that is a very good question, even probably from a biological point of view. Why does my breathing begin? How do I digest anything? How does my mind think anything? All this will require an enormous amount of understanding. And even, I can assure you, even our great Nobel Prize winners in these areas don't have all the answers. Because this is an ongoing study. One is trying to understand how the mind actually functions, and then different qualities of mind, etc. But speaking in a slightly more general way, what the spiritually sages would say, first of all, to be clear that mind itself has different levels. That's the reason I mentioned that in Sanskrit or in ancient Greek also, there are two different words which are used for the mind. Secondly, that there are many levels of reality which are subtler than the mind. Meaning, that's almost really the meaning of something being spiritual. It cannot be grasped by the mind. And in all the teachings, the first avenue to truth is feeling rather than the head, rather than the mind. Heart is touched by something. Sometimes maybe you have yourself felt this, maybe in moments of quiet meditation, or sometimes you're just looking at something large like the stars or the ocean. Whenever something large is there, one is not stuck with one's smallness. No, one is a little free of it. There, one can then sometimes is touched by something and you feel even clear about something, but your friend asks, what were you clear about? You can't say. Maybe you've sometimes had that experience. In fact, even very great scientists actually say, they use the word intuition often. But intuition is a kind of a feeling. It comes from the heart rather than from the head. And some of you may have heard me quote Pascal, a great scientist, saying, heart has reasons that reason does not know. This is actually a direct quote from Pascal. So, first entry to truth is feeling. Any great poets would agree with this, great artists would agree with this, great scientists will all agree with this. But that doesn't mean that one needs to be against the mind. As I have said earlier also, telescope is not the knower, it's a scientist who knows through the telescope. Then the mind is not the knower. All serious teachers say that. But whatever is the knower, which is said to be the higher spirit or Purusha or various labels like that, you could call it God, but it knows through the mind. And then the idea is that there can be a good mind or a bad mind. And in the Yoga Sutras particularly, Patanjali very much emphasizes that the mind needs to be like a completely clear diamond, so that it does not introduce its own color. Whatever it looks at is purely seen the way it is. Otherwise, our mind is always making something out of something. So, your question about the mind, it's a good investigation to watch your own mind. Sometimes, mind is really like a monkey associating one thing with another thing. Personally, I actually feel it belongs to the opposing team. On the other hand, therefore, the call when the mind can become a little quieter, one could then, another way of saying that will be that then one connects with a different level of the mind. The word mind can still be used. No need to be against the mind. But how to move from the monkey mind to the Buddha mind? That's the call. One could still call it the mind. Or sometimes two different words get used, as I mentioned in Sanskrit, manas to buddhi. But descriptions can be given, and some descriptions can speak to you or appeal to you, some don't. But what is actually required for any clear understanding, to look within and to see whether you can yourself sense directly different qualities of the mind. Then you won't be either against the mind or for the mind, but you would wonder, how can I slightly purify this mind? Otherwise, there is always the tendency to be for or against approval or disapproval. Then that's the same world. The whole world is being run exactly by that. A searcher is not against anything, but he doesn't have to simply believe anything. To be free of something can never be possible if I am against that. To be free of something requires to understand its correct or appropriate position. Everything has a place in the world, including the devil. Don't be against the devil either. Find its appropriate place. Yes, sir.
You made a distinction between the spirit and the soul. The soul being personal, the spirit is interpersonal. Can you explain that a little further?
Yes. Well, I think it's partly difficulty with the language maybe, but the suggestion is that whatever we mean by God, one could have used the word spirit for it. But various descriptions are given. These are just labels. But what are the descriptions? More and more consciousness, more and more freedom. We use words like omnipresent, omnipotent, omniscient, etc. But also sense of compassion, sense of love attached with it. I think I gave even several references for this. For example, in the first letter of John, twice it is said, God is love. So, and sometimes I mentioned the Buddha speaking about that beauty is spirituality. So love, truth, beauty, consciousness, these are usually the kind of expressions that people try to hint at, even though all the sages would say they can't really describe what God is. But still, some hints are given. So spirit can be therefore interchangeably used for that. But when we speak about soul, it is really more the particle of this spirit that has, at whatever level it enters into me, with the intention of evolving. But then because it enters into my body and mind, it sometimes gets more associated with it, stuck with it. This is the reason I quoted from Plotinus saying it's amphibious in nature, can sink completely into matter or soar into the one. And therefore the call is, again, this is St. Paul saying, eyes of the spirit see the things of the spirit, eyes of the flesh, the things of the flesh. That one needs to, this idea is, by the way, I just mentioned St. Paul, but it is a very common idea. For example, in the whole alchemical tradition, unless one has a little bit of gold, the lead cannot be turned into gold. Or Christ, another way of saying, unless you're called from heaven, you cannot go to heaven. So the idea is that unless we already have a particle of this divinity in us, there is no possibility of coming to something higher. But then, according to all the sages, we actually have this particle of divinity in us, but it is getting lost. Simple example. For example, if you have a magnetic needle, its main characteristic is to point to the magnetic north. But if there are other magnets around, it cannot point to the magnetic north. So our soul, its main characteristic is to point towards the spirit, but it is stuck with a hell of a lot of other magnets. All our education is against that. Not intentionally, but in practice. How can I compete with other people? How can I do better so I can go to a better college, get a postdoctoral fellowship, so I don't have to pay for my education and get more money, better job? And I just mentioned to you, 90% of PhDs in physics are working for industry or technology. They're searching for truth. So I think the point again and again is that this element is actually there, but there are distracting magnets. Therefore, it does not even point to the north. So first of all, is for a searcher to be a little free of these distracting magnets. not to be wholly occupied with more achievement, more approval, or worrying that I'll be disapproved. Little freedom from that. And for that, it is not possible for most of us, certainly not for me, to be wholly free of it all the time, but to take at least, let us say, half an hour every day. It's almost like in that half an hour I'm going to, but even there, this is, no, it's a good question to raise, really. All questions are serious from my point of view. I think also to realize this is probably much more emphasized in the Indian tradition, more so actually in the Bhagavad Gita, even more so, that the manifested universe actually cannot exist without negative and positive forces being there. And therefore the call to a spiritual searcher is to go beyond duality. To Sanskrit expression is repeatedly said by Krishna, Nirdvandva Bhava Bharata. Become go beyond dualism. And this is very difficult in the Western context, largely historical. For example, Nietzsche, who was very struck actually by the Indian teachings, wrote a book called Beyond Good and Evil, and people thought he had gone crazy. But Krishna, taking his own example, he actually, now let me quote this to you. This is in the 10th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. I am splendor of the splendid, wisdom of the wise, but also the cunning of the cheats. This is Krishna's remark, 10th chapter. You can happily look at it. It's not, I'm just simply making it up. So the point to be made is that without the negative and the positive forces, the manifested universe cannot actually exist. But that doesn't mean that each one of us needs to be stuck with the negative forces. How do we find our position or place in it? And therefore, to see what is the appropriate place of the devil. If I'm just trying to say, get rid of it, as if I can get rid of has there ever been time, even in the presence of the Buddha or presence of Christ, that there was all complete clarity and sanity?
But Krishna did ask Arjuna to fight.
Yes, but to fight, absolutely, but without violence. And also without violence. Because violence for him means being not connected with the right order. Violence doesn't mean simply, as for Gandhi, it seems to mean physical violence. Gandhi, actually, now this may surprise some of you people, I personally heard Krishnamurti say, Gandhi was the most violent person in the 20th century. Because his own son became an alcoholic and ran away, and his wife was terribly feeling this and that. But non-violence doesn't mean physical violence. In fact, this may be of interest to people. We actually had the Supreme Court of Canada about 10 years ago actually passed a judgment which later on they had to revise, because usually it's women who are feeling sexually harassed. But then they hardly ever have, their skirt is not torn, they don't have a wound on their arms or anything. So what's the evidence? Because the evidence is taken physically. Then the Supreme Court actually came to the judgment that if a woman feels assaulted, somebody can, the way they look at you, or the way they use some words, that can assault you. So they said if a woman feels assaulted, she is assaulted. Now, this is, of course, that means that a woman can claim any time to be assaulted. Later on, they had to slightly change it. But the point really here is that physical, this is why I often say to translate ahimsa as non-violence is very limited. It is actually non-violation. If I say to her, unless you marry me, I'm going to commit suicide, what am I doing? You see, one needs to understand that physical violence is much more obvious thing. Emotional, intellectual violation is subtler, and that is much more common. Hardly any woman could ever win a case if it was depending on what is the wound on the body. But they are usually assaulted by the way somebody looks at them, somebody speaks to them. So I think I'm giving very simple example here that one needs to see that violence. So Krishna is speaking about how can he ask Arjuna to go and kill others, but without violence, without hinsa. From his point of view, if it is in the right order, if that is required, so that's required. But ironically, the very people these people killed, the Pandavas killed, they went to heaven before they went to heaven. You know the story in the Mahabharata. I don't want to get into the details of this. Because they were following their right order. Duryodhana went to heaven before Arjuna. Okay, so, yes, sir.
You made the comment that to be against something brings you down to that level. And that is the perfect comment. How is it possible for anybody in this country or Canada or wherever to watch the evening news and not be against something?
I suppose maybe one has to say, what do you mean by being against something? If you mean by that I think it is evil, sure, that's okay. What I'm saying is that if you then pick up your weapons or want to fight against this, you have to come down to the same level. So being against can mean many things. What do you mean by being against something?
Choosing a side,
Yeah.
that one side right and another side wrong.
Sure, this is perfectly fine. This is one of the values of the elections, that you can then choose a president or a prime minister or whosoever officer who you think would do the right, from your perspective, the right action, rather than undertaking the wrong. But nobody is against that.
Thank you.
But partly, I should maybe again emphasize, all spiritual practice, this is again and again, maybe I have tried to already say that here. There is naturally a very strong tendency in each one of us, especially those of us who think we are good people, to try to reform the world. Spiritual practice all has to do about reforming oneself. From where what one does in the world can naturally exude. For example, you can read these remarks. For example, Rumi actually makes this remark. I think I quoted this 2 days ago. Earlier, I was trying to reform the world. Now I'm wiser. I'm simply trying to transform myself. Spiritual practice has to do with that. They are not against reforming the world, but their main concern is reforming themselves. Transform. And so that whatever their level of or quality is, the right attitude exudes out of this. If the Buddha is enlightened, compassion will exude out of him. It's not that he decides to be compassionate. To imagine that he is enlightened and not compassionate will be actually an oxymoron. Similarly, for Christ to say that the Father and I are one, and if love doesn't exude out of him, he is not one with the Father. Krishnamurti particularly tried to emphasize this point very strongly, Don't try to do good. If you are good, good will ooze out of you. And he gave this example. A rose does not decide to smell like a rose. We recognize the presence of a rose from its fragrance. No, it's very important to, I'm talking about what is regarded in the spiritual practice. They're not against doing something in the world, but their whole occupation is transformation of my whole quality of my being. That is the purpose of any spiritual practice. That doesn't mean that there is nothing to be done in the world. One can undertake charities, one can support those people who are fighting on the right side, vote for the right president rather than the wrong. All this is fine. Nobody is against that.
Something that's been helpful for me before with the question of how to be not against something is something you've said, which is to forget about what you're against, think about what you're for. And so instead of mothers against drunk driving, it could be mothers for sober driving, right? And I think that reminds me of what you're saying is like, what am I aiming myself toward? What am I devolving myself against?
No, I think I probably have said that earlier at some stage, because I feel this is a very important slight distinction to be made initially, but more importantly, the right action or right direction. Because one can get so stuck with what I am against, but energy needs to be used for what I am for. And certainly from the spiritual side, we don't need to simply buy what these guys are saying, but if it strikes you, if you are interested in what Christ said or what the Buddha said or what Krishna said, Krishna repeatedly is saying to come to Madhbhav, to come to my nature of being. Not an easy job, I can assure you. Even the Buddha took many lifetimes to come to something. But that is the spiritual side. So that is what one is for. Then to say, well, I am against the demons, sure. You can keep fighting with the demons. And the universe, as I said, at least in the Indian perspective, it can't even exist without the demons also being there. And in the Christian perspective, there is this notion that at the end, with the second coming of Christ, the devil will just go to hell. He will disappear. You can never find this kind of remark in the Indian tradition. As long as the universe exists, the devil will also exist. But that doesn't mean that I have to specially love the devil. That's not what I'm suggesting. But what am I for? What is my energy for? Let's take a minute or two to be quiet. We have to stop then.